Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and I'm back. So I've mentioned several times in previous videos that I was moving to Florida. I have officially moved to Florida. I have like no furniture, no nothing. Right now my desk is literally boxes of the limited stuff that I have so far. So it actually works pretty well. Note to self, in the future, build desks out of boxes. But essentially what I wanted to do is just kind of do a video to get used to my new setup and my new home. So you shouldn't be hearing any sirens. The bird is still in transit, so you shouldn't hear the bird either. So it's going to be a quiet video. Although the headset that I replaced my previous headset with, I don't think is as good as the previous one. We'll see. Although I do have another one of my previous one packed away, but the stuff that's being moved won't get here for 3 weeks. But anyways, what I want to do in this video is just use plain JS to create a client-side rendered website. In the style that you would see with like React, Vue, or Angular, just so that way you kind of get the idea. So that way you can see like, hey, if what's really kind of going on under the hood if we were to just do it in sort of plain JavaScript theoretically. Okay, there's always a lot more going on the hood because there's things to optimize, but we'll play around with that. So let's see here. So I'm going to create a new folder, and we'll just call it plain vanilla client, meaning plain vanilla JS, and we're going to do client-side rendering. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reopen VS Code in that folder. Good. Okay, and I'm going to close this window. And let's just create, actually I'll just use terminal to create all the things. Okay, so let's do this. Let's make dir the standard stuff. So we will create a CSS folder, a CSS folder. We'll create a JSON folder so we can kind of mock an API call. CSS JSON. We want a JavaScript folder, and theoretically an image folder if we had any photos. Okay, so that creates the folders, which we can see got created over here. Now I want to create some files. So touch. So again, this is the bash terminal. So if you're on Windows, those commands be slightly different. But yeah, so touch would be to create files. So I want to touch an index.html. I want to touch a css/styles.css. I want to touch a app.js, that'd be in the JS folder, so js/app.js. And I want to touch in the JSON folder a data.json. Okay, and let's take a look at these files got created. JSON, there it is. There it is. No, I didn't make anything in that folder. There we go. Cool. So let's scope out our index.html using Emmet. I'll just use the exclamation point. And boop, there's all my standard HTML stuff. Let's link our files. So first I'll link the CSS file, styles.css, and that's actually going to be in the CSS folder. So it's going to be ./CSS/style.css. Then I want to link script tag. Okay, and that's going to have j./js/app.js. Okay, and I'll add a defer keyword so that way it doesn't run until after the DOM is loaded. And I think that's pretty good for now. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to have a div, just kind of like React style, where it's just a div with the ID of app. Okay, so essentially I'm going to just mount my entire website into this div. That's how we're going to do it. Okie dokie. So that's it. That's it for this file. JavaScript. Okay, I'm not going to use jQuery. I'm not using React. It's going to be pure, plain vanilla browser DOM. I could use web components, but I'm not going to use web components today. We're just going to see how you can do this with just raw JavaScript. Okay, and I am going to kind of have We'll set it up this way. Okay, first we're going to create a variable called state, which will just be an object, just kind of simulate sort of like ways you've seen this kind of patterns in React. So we're going to have a object called state, which right now won't have any state. Okay, and actually we should probably declare that const state, application state. Okay, and then we're gonna have a render function, const render equals okay, and that's going to do nothing for now. And then we're going to have a const setState function. Again, I want to copy more of a React pattern, which will take the new state, and what it's going to do is just say if, and it's just so you can see kind of like what React does. React, in order to optimize and not cause unnecessary, rendering processes, it's going to check. It's going to say, hey, does the new state not equal the current state? Okay. And actually, on that note, I want to make this let, because we're going to want to be able to reassign that. Okay. So essentially, I'm just saying, hey, like if the data, the state of the app has changed, if they have changed, then you're going to reassign it. So then we'll just do state equals new state. Okay, and then in that case, what we'll do is we'll run the render function, which will then pass the state. Okay, cool. Otherwise, setState does nothing. That's pretty much how it works in React. Okay. Cool. Okay. So now let's render some things. Okay. So what do I want to happen when I render? And again, when I render, the state gets passed in, which actually I'll just pass as S. Okay. So what we're going to do is we'll do a to-do list. So I'm going to we'll pretend that we're going to get data from an API. So we'll call this property called to-dos. So this is JSON. To-dos. So I'm just creating some data, and to-dos will be an array. And in that array will just be a bunch of strings. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Okay. Cool. Okay. Nice. So we're gonna just, in anticipation that I'm gonna eventually ask for that data from the JSON file, I'm gonna make sure there's a place for it. So I'll just create to-dos in state, and it'll just start out as an empty array. Okay, cool. So we start off with an empty array in to-dos, and then when the page loads, okay, or whenever we render, what's going to do is it's going to first grab the div. So const we'll say app equals document.query selector. So we're selecting the div with the ID of app. Okay, and again, back in our index.html, we created this div with the ID of app that we're selecting. Good. And then what I want to do is I want to, whenever this thing gets rendered, what I want to do is generate a h1 for each of the to-dos. Okay, so then what I want to do is do a loop. So we'll say s dot to-dos, because to-dos, s is the state, because again I named the parameter s, and we know that whenever we call render, I'm going to pass in the state, so I know that this is going to be the state. Okay. So s.todos, we'll say for each. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Dot for each. For each takes a function. So it's going to loop over those to-dos. So that's going to be a single to-do each time. Okay, and s.todos dot for each. What do I want to do? I want to create a new h1, so that'd be document So const h1 equals document dot create element, and I want to create an h1, and then I want to make sure that h1 dot inner text equals the current to do. So whatever the current to do is, breakfast, lunch, dinner, I want the text of the h1 to equal that. And then I want to attach that h1. I'm going to append that h1 to the app. So app dot h1 app dot append h1. Okay, and that'll just attach that node at the end of there. Now here's the thing though, I don't want to, well, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to how we'll fix that. So essentially what we're doing is I'm selecting the app node, and then I'm looping over and creating an h1 node and putting it inside that div for each item inside that to-do list, which in the beginning there's going to be none. Okay, so again, we're going to do an initial call, start the app, render. I'm going to be passing the state. Okay. Cool. Let's see here. Should I make this an H1? Let's make this an H2. H2, because I want to manually add an H1 for the title. So const title equals document dot create element and H1, and the title dot inner text is going to equal my to-do list. Okay, so I hit save. Now let's run this just so we can see that H1 shows up. So I'm going to right click here, open with live server. That's an extension you have to install. So if you don't see it, that means you haven't installed the extension yet. I'm going to open that up. And I don't see, so let's first open up the inspector, see if there's any errors. Okay. Okay, so that means I probably put the error wrong because it's style, but it's supposed to be styles. Failed to reload. Okay, so it's probably just errored there and it didn't go any further. Okay, well, it call the app.js, so let's go back to here. First, let's fix this, styles.css. And let's go back over here. We define state, render, and set state. Then we rerun render, which, I never appended the title. App.append title. And see, there we go. Okay, it's appending the title when the page loads. Right now you don't see any to-do list because there's nothing in the to-do list yet. Okay, so getting used to the new version of Pop OS. Cool. So let's see here. Okay, so then the next thing I wanted to do is when the page loads, we want to call that data from, the JSON file. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do fetch data from the JSON file. So I'm going to do a fetch, and we're going to fetch from the JSON folder, the data.json file. Then we're going to do a .then, and we're going to take the response and turn it into JavaScript object. That's what this does. And then I'm going to take that, should result in my data, so I'll use it. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that should work. We should just be able to sit there and say setState data. Okay, and what that's going to do is going to pass that data object from our JSON file, which is an object with to-dos, replace the current state with that, and then rerun render. So now I should see the to-dos. My to-do list. Now see, it ran render twice. We know that Because see, we see my to-do list twice because it added the title a second time. It didn't add the to-dos though, so that's something we'll have to explore. So let me think here. Set state, the data should be this data here. So technically to-do should be breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So technically when it gets to here, it should be like state.todos for each. Okay, so that's interesting. Now let's do a few things to diagnose the problem. One, we're going to console log s. We're going to see what it's receiving as state. We want to, because apparently the data is not working the way I think it does. Now the other issue we want to run into is that we don't want this title being added every time it renders. So what we're going to do is we're going to always clear out app at the beginning of each render. So app dot, is there a clear function? I always forget. Or empty. Okay, well, the easy way to do this would just be to inner HTML. And then just do equals, has the same effect. Okay, I was clearing the whole div. So that way, every time it runs this render function, it's not adding the title again, it's removing the previous title and then replacing it. Okay, so now, there, let's take a look for that console log. So we do have the array. So s.todos is this array of 3 strings. Okay, uncut, in promise, reference error, h1 is not defined. Oh, I know why. Because again, we originally did this as an h1, but we changed it to an h2, and I forgot to change these to h2. So that should work now. And there we go. Okay, so see, we have my to-do list, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Okay, so first it rendered an empty list of to-dos, then it did the call for the JSON data, then re-rendered, and this is essentially how React works, or a Vue, or Svelte. Essentially, the data changes, the UI updates it. Every time you're changing the data, changing the state. And just think about the state just means these are global variables, or, well, they're data that reflects how your app works. So basically, your app works differently when your state changes. Okay, so notice my title is not in the app because the title doesn't change ever. Okay, so it's not state. But the to-dos may change. So that's part of my state. These are the things that may change, and my app's behavior will be different when that state changes. That's what it means by state. It's not just a React thing. It's just a concept of these variables that determine the behavior of my application. Okay, so just kind of run through this logic again. Essentially what happens, every time I run the setState function, it's updating the state variable and then running this render function, which then rebuilds the UI. Again, pretty much how React more specifically works, but use the same principles exist within Angular, Vue, Svelte, all the other ones. Now let's create let's some changes where you can actually add like a to-do. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to add a div. Okay, so we're going to add another div. So we'll call this the form div. So const form div. Or actually, I won't even do it there. Okay, you wouldn't necessarily do this in React, but we're not in React. So in this case, since I am doing this in plain JavaScript, I don't have to client-side render things that don't need to be client-side rendered. The form is going to be there regardless. So in that case, I'm going to just put it in my HTML. It's actually a faster way of doing it. JavaScript takes a little bit longer to run than HTML. So if I can write something in the actual HTML file, okay, that's not necessarily going to be changing very much, might as well. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to write this div with an ID of form, just in case I need that for styling purposes or some other purpose. Okay. I didn't put the closing, there we go. And then let's put the closing div. Okay, now in here, I am going to want 2 inputs. Okay, so input times 2, or actually I'll just do it this way. Input with the type of text. Yep. And then I want an input with the type of submit. Yay for Emmett for creating these HTML tags a little bit easier. Okay, so there's my 2 inputs. And actually these need to be inside of a form. So let's add a form element. Okay, so let's cut this out and put that inside the form. Okay, let me save this so that way it pretties it up a little bit. There we go. Actually, I would prefer that these are on separate lines. So I'm going to do exactly that. There we go. Okay, so I have these two inputs. Don't need to worry about an action. Okay, there we go. Okay, wonderful. And now what I'm going to do is we'll create some logic here. Okay, so I'm going to just create some variables. Const for the text input. So const text equals document.query selector. So I'm going to grab the element selector and I want to select the input that has the type of text. I'll just copy this line since I'm going to be pretty much doing the same thing. And this is going to be the submit button. And this is going to be the form. So I'm going to select those things, and I want to select, I want the input, but except I want the one that has an input of type submit. And then this one, I just want to select the form element. Okay, cool. So I have those now all saved in there. And what I want to do is I want to add an event for when the form is submitted. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do next. So basically, every time it renders, we're going to update this submit event, or basically all this gets run again. Which actually makes the question: do I really need to add it again? Okay, maybe I don't need to put it here because technically the form's behavior won't change. So let's not do that. Control X. Let's put it outside of the form. It doesn't have. Every time the state changes, the form doesn't need to be rebuilt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build the form before the fetch. Set up form event handler. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say form.add event listener. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, when you submit the form, something happens. So basically the event is a submit event, and then the function that runs, which always receives the event object, is the following. So just like any form, and whether it's in a framework or not, we need to do the whole event.prevent default thing first to prevent the page from refreshing, or else the page just will refresh every time we click on the submit button. Event.prevent default. And then what I want to do is update the state. So I want to create some new state, a new object. So const new state equals a new object. So I'm going to use curly brackets, but I want what's inside of the state to be exactly like the current state. So I'm going to use the spread operator to spread the state in there. So that way this new object is basically a replica of the existing state. But what I want to do is I want to update the new state. I want to take its to-dos array. Okay, and actually, I mean, technically this is not quite as necessary as it is in React because of the way I create. No, it's still necessary because I'm doing a lazy comparison. So in that case, it has to be a new object. Because even if I were to just modify the state and then pass it in, this would not work because technically the old state would, even though I changed something in the state, it's not a new object. So it's still the same object. So it'd be like, oh, the old states, they're equal, so it won't render again. Like that's the big thing in React. You have to realize that like when you pass object or an array as a state, it's got to be a new object, not just an altered, the previous state but altered. Okay, so that's why I'm creating a new state, because I want a new object, because two objects will be not equal to each other. While the same object, even if it was altered from where it was before, will equal itself. Just a weird quirk. If you want to know more about that, I would recommend looking up JavaScript reference versus value. So you can understand like what does it mean when I say like an object, an array is passed by reference versus like numbers and booleans are passed by value. Very important concept, very useful. Okay, new state dot to-dos. Okay, so basically what I want to do is I want to push the new to-do in there, and that to-do, I technically I'm never going to need this line here, so I can pretty much comment this line out now that I think about it. Okay, because technically the submit event that I'm doing here on the form takes care of that. I just don't need that. Okay, in case I'll leave it commented it out for now. Because all I really need is the value of this input. So I'm just going to grab text.value. Okay, and so that updates the state. So now I'm going to do setState to say, hey, this new object that I just created, like this new copy of the old state that I changed, I want that to be the new state. So new state. And that's going to go through that whole render process again where it rebuilds the DOM. Okay, which makes me realize that I probably, no, that's fine because these are separate divs, so we're good. Okay. Set state. And the only thing I want to do is I want to make sure I empty out the form. So text dot value equals an empty string, so that way the form empties out when we hit submit. And then that should do it. So basically all I'm doing, so you notice I'm not going up there to update. All I'm doing is I'm changing the state. But this setState function, what it does, it updates the value of state and then calls the render function again. And then the render function rebuilds what we see on the screen. This is essentially how React is working under the hood. That's why, if you don't know React yet, then this is a good preview. But the idea is that this is why whenever you need to change or update the state, the data that affects your app, you always have to call this setState function first. Because it's not just updating the state. It's updating the state and then passing the new state to a render function that renders your code. Okay, but now this should be working. So let's go back to the browser. Oh, something's weird there. Okay, I mistyped something. I left something open. So form div input type text type submit. What doesn't it like? Let's refresh. Oh, there we go. I just need to refresh the page. Okay, so if I want to add brunch, so I add brunch, I type brunch in the form, I hit submit, and see what happened is that brunch got pushed, basically a new copy of the state got made, which had that to-dos array in it. We pushed brunch into that array, then we passed that new object to the setState function, which replaced the old state's value with this new object, and then passed that state to the render function, which then re-rendered this section of the page over again. Now again, it's only re-rendering this section. Now in React or Vue or Svelte, you essentially build your whole app in that section. And that's where you build the components, and you have components that are with that. So basically your main component's app, and then the app renders other components which render other components which render under components. And then that's essentially how this works. So technically like this and this is kind of outside the purview of the render. Actually, let me think about that. I think I am still rendering the title each time. Yeah, so see here I'm rendering, no I'm not. Am I rendering the title each time? Where's the title? Yeah, I am rendering the title each time. So that's technically unnecessary. Like that's the thing with React, where it's rendering the whole component, it's rendering everything each time. And that's where like there's all these little like machinations and tools and hooks to help you kind of, you know, optimize that performance and make sure you're not re-rendering things that don't need to be re-rendered. But it can be a lot of work. You could do it with JavaScript and just plain JavaScript get the same result, and only the things that need to be re-rendered will be re-rendered. It'll be a lot faster, but you have to write a lot more code. Okay, like you see here, like this is a decent amount of JavaScript code that I just wrote just to get this basic to-do list functionality. This is why I personally really enjoy things like Svelte and Solid.js. The way they work is a little bit different. What they do is they let you write your code and then they'll render it to JS, and they'll kind of connect all these things in the way to kind of minimize the redundant renders without having to create. The way the React deals with it is, and I think Vue and Angular, is they use this thing called a virtual DOM. So basically, as you re-render, it creates a virtual like object in memory that is a copy of what should be on the screen. And what it does, it copies it to the actual DOM in the browser, the actual object that determines what's on the screen. That's essentially the DOM is like this thing. So if we go back to the browser and I look in here, like this is the DOM. So this is actually like a JavaScript object. And then each of these are just like, another object instead of an object instead of an object. This whole tree of objects. And it takes a look at the real DOM object, the real document object, compares it to this virtual document object, and only replaces the parts that don't match. But that's still a whole lot of like, and again, if you do React, you never are like thinking about this. This is just something that's happening under the hood. But there's a lot of steps, and again, there's been a lot of optimizations to make that process as efficient as possible. But at the end of the day, what's more efficient than just skipping that whole process altogether and making it where only the things that need to update. So this is why I'm always like very, very big on making sure that like your core JavaScript skills are strong. Because then you realize like what do you need to do in JavaScript versus what you don't need to do in JavaScript. And versus when does it make sense to bring in something like React, Vue, or Angular, Svelte, or Solid.js versus just doing it in basic JavaScript. Okay, for a lot of basic applications, you can create very interactive, very fast applications by just using JavaScript. And you can organize your code fairly well. And now there's native web components, which I've done plenty of videos on, where you could, if you do like that component type the reusability of web components, you can just use that without having to go bring in a framework for a lot of things. Like you can create a reusable, modal, a reusable, all sorts of things. Not gonna do that now, but hopefully like this helped make a few things kind of click if you're in the midst of learning React. If you're learning JavaScript, hopefully like this just kind of shows you how we can use JavaScript in the browser. And overall, this gave me a nice test run of my new setup here. So I'll see you all, and you all have a good time.